Yes, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Cannon Podcast. It is George V underscore AFC here, and I am really excited about doing this pod. For all you nerds out there, I think that this is going to be a really interesting podcast to get into some of the nitty gritty details and why are Arsenal so good at set pieces. I think it's been something that's had a lot of media attention, certainly in the last 8 months. But before we get into anything, I've got a really great guest for everybody who I think, for me at least, has been the set piece guru on X. Really excited, Jake, mate. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you. You've caught me at the back end of an illness, so we're doing okay. I might be a bit stumbly, might be a bit nasally, but I think in general I'm okay and should be able to give some sort of insight to the nerds, as you say.
It's kind of the season, isn't it? We were just talking offline about. I feel, at least from a Canada perspective, like the temperature's changing. We're definitely out of summer, and it's definitely kind of going into the winter part of fall, really, to be honest. So we really appreciate you powering through. But first, mate, how can everybody find you on X, and kind of maybe give a little quick spiel about either your account and kind of what you're doing as well? Because I know you, and maybe listeners might not, from the Pot Shot Pod, which is doing brilliant work down there. But why don't you give us a quick rundown of kind of what you're doing on Twitter as well as in the podcast?
Yeah, so generally people can find me on X at setpiecesicko, which is like the most on the nose branding that's possibly available to me, but we live by what we are at this point. So I'm mainly doing articles on that. I'm a bit dry on that front at the moment, but I try to keep up to date with threads if there's anything interesting. So I recently did one on Brentford, for example, doing their kickoff stuff. And then, yeah, kind of on and off on Potshot Pod, but we have like a huge group of people on there. So if it's not me, someone else, I'm teaching them slowly about set pieces as well. So it's not just if you're looking for set pieces, you need me. But yeah, Potshot Podcast on Spotify, whatever you use.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, everybody you guys can find. We're going to do a whole breakdown. So right now, we're just going to do a really quick overview to give you all a sneak peek, because Jake is going to do some brilliant work to hopefully teach me a little bit about set pieces. And you guys can find the rest of the pod off on Patreon, which we'll shout out in the description as well. We'll also put kind of the Pot Shot Pod and also Jake's credentials down there if you wanted to find him on both X as well as his podcast. So you can find all that stuff in the link in the description. I think that's all the intro stuff I can finally get into this nitty gritty. So, mate, really quickly, I think set pieces, we're going to have a breakdown on everything. But I think one of the biggest questions I get, at least on X, is, this whole idea of whether or not Arsenal set pieces are sustainable. And I've had a lot of time to try to think, and, as if the football gods have heard our questions, they have got out with a brilliant Opta article just as we are recording and been able to comprehensively kind of picked a lot of things. For yourself, really quickly, do you find Arsenal set pieces sustainable? Do you understand the questions from people maybe that haven't done the look into the set pieces as deeply as you, why it may not be the case? Or where's your head at about sustainability on something that is so coachable?
Yeah, I mean, I can see why they're natural questions, because I came into the season having kind of a slight doubts as to whether it could be as sustainable as it was last season, because Arsenal set some pretty crazy, not quite records, but it's pretty high numbers, and we don't normally see teams produce those sorts of numbers as consistently as Arsenal have. At least not doing so the way they have, I think, is the thing. I think part of it's an aesthetic that big crashing headers are normally reserved for the lower teams, your Stokes, your West Broms, your Tony Pulis sides. So the idea of sustainability doesn't really ring true, because teams don't usually generate the number of opportunities that Arsenal do. Whereas a team like Man City, for example, score a lot of corners. They have a lot of set piece goals they scored. They're one of the only two sides, along with Conte's Chelsea, who have scored more than Arsenal did last season from set pieces, but they do so in a different way. And so there's not really a question of sustainability on City's end, because whilst they kind of favour like the short corners, stuff that fits within their wider approach, Arsenal's wider approach is a bit more direct, a bit more physical. And so the question of sustainability becomes a bit more prominent, because you're looking at a contrasting style in your head of being like, well, these kinds of headers aren't scored regularly. They're not scored because it's sustainably. Whereas City might score a ton of intricate 10 pass moves from a corner, that still counts as a set piece goal, but you don't really think of it as that, because on match of the day, for example, you'll see like 2 or 3 passes around the box and it'll look like a City goal.
Yeah, and you know what? It's really interesting because I've always struggled personally between patterned movement, which is coaching, and people broadcast that as quite sustainable. Generally, it doesn't even have to be set pieces, but when we talk about tactics and whatnot, we try to break down things, anything that's repeatable through a pattern, we sit there and we start to say, hey, that's sustainable. But then, mate, for example, I always struggle when I look at a Harry Kane, for example, or your top finishers. They overperform XG regularly. Why? Because they're elite players. And when you talk about it, it is sustainable for the best goal scorers. And when you have a look at Arsenal's squad composition, so not just introducing Mikel Merino, Kai Havertz, I've got some interesting stats about Kai Havertz that I'm sure you've talked about before on X. But when you look at just the general composition between Calafiore now, you've got Gabriel, who is scoring goals at an inordinate rate for a center back anyways, Saliba, Ben White. You're looking at a very competent team that I don't know if we've seen even in the Stoke days that has been so physically imposing and dominant in aerial duels, not just on set pieces, but just when you're talking about a team that chooses to go to direct, but then is made up of such direct players. Is that luck, or is that a well thought out process, much in the same way that a pattern may be repeatable in terms of a passing movement? So yeah, it's a really interesting debate. The one big thing is I'll show a really quick graph kind of on how everybody else in the league is taking their set pieces. And maybe you could kind of walk us through what you see differently in terms of the rest of the league. So here, for those that are listening, you might have a little bit of a difficult time looking at this graph, but it is a graph that Optus released in terms of looking at how each team in the Premier League take their crossed corners, just really broadly speaking. And it kind of delineates it between in-swinging corners and out-swinging corners. So for you, mate, we'll definitely get into the arsenal of it all, but does this graph give you any kind of impetus for yourself about any kind of conclusions that you're seeing broadly in the league? I think Arsenal actually are one of the outliers. It's the only team that does the 100% in-swinging thing. Where do you stand on the benefits of in-swingers versus out-swingers?
Oh, that is a question. I think the key takeaway on whether in-swing versus out-swinging works very well is if you look at the teams that really favour in-swinging, we're in quite good company, I think. So you look, we've got us, we've got the set-piece nerds, Brentford, with 96 to 4%. If you're in the same group as Brentford for a set-piece stat, you're doing quite well. You have Aston Villa, who have Austin McPhee, who is an absolute kind of genius on set-piece plays. Sometimes overcomplicates it, as we saw at Villa Park with the Onana kind of like halfway line saunter, if you remember that. But they also really favour in-swingers. And then Chelsea, who stole Brentford's set-piece guru, Bernardo Cueva, in the summer as well. So they're really heavily favouring it. And I think, for me, I quite like an in-swinger as opposed to an out-swinger, just because the momentum is more intrinsic from the taker. And so you really need like a quality taker and a quality header, for instance, like a Trent and a Van Dijk, for an outswinger to be worth it most of the time. Or you have to do like a two-phase thing where it kind of gets headed back across. So similar to the Martinelli's first goal of the season away at Crystal Palace, I think 2 seasons ago, 22-23.
Right.
So that sort of thing, that wasn't an outswinger, but it's that sort of play where it has to kind of be staggered in phases because the momentum isn't built into the kick. So that's probably where I'm much more of an in-swinging guy, and probably because I'm supporting a team that takes 100% in-swingers, admittedly. But I think that you can do a lot better. And like, if you look at this, like all these crosses are coming in with a natural momentum and natural kind of gravity towards the net, which outswingers don't really have. So it's much easier as like a chaos inducer for me, I think.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, again, like it's really stark when you've got 100% of something done. That's absolutely a little bit more of an outlier compared to the league. But it's something like we've got 47 of the 50 crosses in this season, and not one of them has been an outswinger. So it's clearly something that not just Arsenal, but Nicholas Jover believes is a non-negotiable. If we were to say, what is a non-negotiable of Arsenal's set piece routine? I think it's interesting, again, when you pair such direct routes We'll get into our nitty gritty of some of our patterns because we do patterns in set pieces, but I agree with you that we're quite vertical or direct, in fact, with our routines, generally speaking. And we've got some of the most quality. I mean, in terms of deliveries, Bukayo Saka stands out as a deliverer in the Premier League right now from pure quality. And when you're talking on the pure quality aspect, again, Gabriel scoring some of the most, at least as a scoring rate, inordinate from other center backs. We've got talent here. And when you look at it, we've had the most shots following corners, 27 in the top flight this season, with the highest expected goals of 3.4 xG from these types of situations. And we have the highest average per corner of 0.067 xG on average from each of these corners, which is a lot of numbers to say that we're pretty good. And when we talk about kind of where these kind of corner routines end on, this is a brilliant graph that I felt like is pretty interesting, actually, to me. There's definitely a penchant towards back post and kind of in the 6-yard box. For you, do you feel that there is a best location for a corner? I mean, someone rudimentary wise might say, hey, look, closer to goal, obviously the better, but isn't that the most crowded? Where do you stand on front post kind of routines versus back post routines generally? And do you like to see things done more directly like Arsenal do, or through greater passing movements?
Wow. Okay. That's a hell of a question. Woof. So, I mean, there's some like different schools of thought, I suppose, where you can follow like the Gianni Vio route, which was very famous at Spurs, with the flick on at the front post to someone crashing in at the back post. And that kind of defined how a lot of set pieces were approached, or corners specifically were approached for ages, where the first contact is so vital because it fundamentally changes how you have to defend the space and how you have to kind of calibrate your defense in order to deal with that first touch and deal with that, the fact that you don't have control as soon as that first touch is made. And I kind of like that. I kind of get behind that, but I am a bit favored towards just a big, like, curved whip back post. I think it's what made Rice's growth as a taker from January onwards, like, so interesting, is that we'd never really had someone who get like up high, dipping, swerving round to the back post. It's quite similar to McNeil's at Everton, before Onana was stolen by Aston Villa and McPhee, where if you use physicality well, which Arsenal obviously do, as we talked about, kind of the nature of that squad, the back post becomes really, really undefendable because you have to get through so many bodies to try and deal with this normally really deep and curving cross, but also a lot of huge blocking bodies and then huge crashing bodies at the back post. I think for a squad like Arsenal's, I can see why we're going for back post a lot more, because it seems like a bit of a waste to take all that physicality or that bulk and keep it maintained outside the front post.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because, again, I kind of go back to this whole debate about pattern play versus just pure quality ultimately. And sometimes when you talk about defending set pieces, which I think is what we're going to go to transition into, having a look at how Premier League teams defend their 6-yard box, it's always this push and play, right? But when you have a look at it, Arsenal absolutely clearly lead the league in terms of how they crowd the 6-yard box. And, we'll definitely get into kind of maybe the minutia a little bit later in the pod. But when you have a look at it, we crowd the player, or the box rather, with an average of about 3.8 players inside the box, definitely the highest rate in the Premier League. And I think one of the interesting things for me, at least, is how we use these players to create separation and how we use these differences in or at least we throw the most amount of people in, but how we use these people to create space in the box is really, really interesting. So from a broad structure kind of perspective, could you walk us all through some of these really basic terms about set pieces in terms of what a dummy run might be, a blocker, whether when we say we go zonal versus man-to-man, how do you interpret some of these really basic terms for the layperson to kind of get an understanding?
Yeah, and please feel free to tell me to shut up if I'm going too hard on certain terms and avoiding the lay description, because it's quite possible, considering how deeply entrenched in this awful minefield I've been for so long. But yeah, so we'll start kind of left to right. So the dummy runs in this case, you can see, well, you can probably not see, it's Trossard and Kai, and their main job within this setup, and Partey, the back post as well. Their main role within this setup is to attract and use their own gravity to move players away from any key target areas. So our target area in this example is just in front of Vicario on that 6-yard line, which is where Gabriel, the green one, is running straight towards. And so our dummy runs are there to genuinely imply a movement that the opposition have to react to. Because if you're receiving a corner, you are kind of at the whim of the opposition takers. And if you decide to go, oh no, they're dummy runs, and all of a sudden those players pick up the ball, take for instance, I think Trossard moving outside the defensive block in the Everton away game last year, where we ended up scoring that nice routine with that ridiculous Trossard finish. If you kind of ignore that and go, okay, he's out of our jurisdiction, you can get plays like that. And so Tottenham have to respond here with those players in orange, with those dummy runs, which allows our blockers in this case. So our blockers in this scenario is quite an Arsenal specific term in this case, where we are using the opposition to block the opposition goalkeeper. So just holding place basically. So Saliba is not really moving here. Ben White's moving a bit, but in general, the idea is to stay within a small area and earn this space in the front of the 6-yard box by being a presence that prevents Tottenham from entering it. In much the same way that the dummy runners are doing by dragging all the players away from the area, the players in red are standing there so that Tottenham can't then fill that area back up.
And it's really interesting because, I mean, clearly based off the rule changes that, again, were inspired by Arsenal doing some stuff from last season, it's just really interesting to see Nicolas Jover completely pivot but maintain the same principle by ultimately trying to prevent an ability for a goalkeeper to kind of claim those crosses. And I wonder if it's because we have such an elite cross claimer in David Raya that we're able to almost see the benefit of what that does to set pieces. And maybe if we can prevent that happening from opposition, how that actually impacts us in terms of generating space. But for all you visual learners, it could be really technical. So we'll get into a really quick example with City. Jake, could you walk us through a little bit? This is us defending a set piece, right? Mm-hmm. And kind of the idea between man-to-man. There are some people doing man-to-man. There are some people doing zonal. What are the yellow arrows? What do we kind of do, broadly speaking, from a defensive perspective between zonal and man-to-man assignments?
So it's actually been a really interesting season from defensive corner setups, which is like the nerdiest thing I've ever said in my life. But it has been, because last season we were quite staunch in how we used zonals and man markers, which primarily we used zonals to kind of earn the space around David Raya, and then he would come and claim through the gaps. But against City and against Spurs, we actually cut down our zonal markers to just the guys in yellow. So Kai Havertz and Gabriel are only zonal markers, i.e. the ones who are not being given a player to mark, they're given a space to mark, which is in front of David Raya in the 6-yard box. And everyone else is given a man to cover. As you see Saliba with Haaland at the back post, like in the far corner. You see Declan Rice with, I think that's Ruben Dias. You see Rodri. This is moments before the incident. But yes, Rodri is getting pulled apart, and then Timber in the middle, holding Akanji. And I think Akanji's role is very similar to Saliba's in that last image, to try and block the space for David Raya to come and claim, but obviously a bit further out. And then we have Saka, who's doing a bit of a kind of both of a job on the edge, watching Jeremy Doku, covering the space on the edge, but also that's his player to cover. That's the general gist of it. And it's to give our best headers, Kai and Gabriel, the chance to clear balls that Raya probably wouldn't be able to get. Mm-hmm. And also not have them dragged out of the play by a very fast running Haaland or something.
Right. So I think, in generally speaking, similar to like a press, if I was to break it down very simply, you have a hybrid approach. Mm-hmm. Just like how our press isn't pure zonal, isn't just like how our press isn't pure man-to-man. It would be fair to say essentially that our routines have a mix of man-to-man and zonal principles. Is that correct?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. And so I mean, I think we kind of see this in different moments, at least in the city match, where again, just as you've pointed out, the front post it seems to be zonal. Is there a reason for you at least why back post seems to be man to man generally, if you could segment these things, and then front post is particularly more zonal? Again, it's not something that we've repeated necessarily enough to call it a pattern, but it's definitely something I noticed, at least in the last 18 months. Is there a reason for you why a coach would prefer to go zonal when defending the front post as opposed to the back post?
I think it kind of comes down to the fact that these are your best headers. And most crosses, most people who are delivering these corners are not really going to be able to get them deeper into the back post. So we talk about Rice and Saka being such excellent deliverers of the ball, but they also kind of struggle sometimes to get it deeper back post. Rice, especially this season, has struggled quite a lot. And so you kind of want to have your best headers in a place where they can make the most impact and prevent a lot of opposition attacks and a lot of opposition flick-ons and stuff like that. So it kind of goes back to the idea of Gianni Villa in the same sense, where by ensuring we get that first contact, by having our really good guys there, we will not be at the whim of an opposition flick-on, opposition second play. And Havertz is just an absolute godsend in that regard. So I think Havertz has kind of enforced us to really be even further down that way of giving our a strong base for a zonal. And then also, like you mentioned in terms of Raya's cross-claiming, is that we can afford to be a bit more loose back post because Raya is so aggressive off his line and will come for anything from about the penalty spot deeper.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And you know what? This has been amazing. I just don't want the conversation to stop. But unfortunately, that's it for all of you YouTube members as well as free audience members. We hope you guys enjoyed it. We're definitely going to be able to go into more detail kind of in the Patreon. So if you guys enjoyed what you're hearing, you can pop off onto the Patreon. The link's going to be down below as well. But before we kind of sign off from at least YouTube, Jake, could you just give everybody a quick roundup again where they can find you and your brilliant work? Because this is just incredible. And I think it's something that, is so niche, but at the same time has given us such a marginal game, and it's important.
Yeah, so you can find me on X at setpiecesicko, and then at PotshotPod as well on X, and Potshot Podcast on pretty much any podcast provider, I hope.
Exactly. Brilliant. So guys, thank you so much. We appreciate you guys sticking with us. If you guys like this, make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. And of course, if you can find us again on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as on the Patreon, which will be in the link in the description below. So thank you guys for tuning in, and thanks for keeping it Arsenal.